John Neely Kennedy stood in the corner of the Grand Library, his fingers tracing the smooth wood of a centuries-old table. The room smelled of old leather and ink. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and soft light filtered through the tall windows. Around him, boys in pressed uniforms whispered and laughed, their voices dripping with a confidence John couldn't imitate. He had made the mistake of reading aloud. Just a few lines from Thoreau, and suddenly the room had stilled. Then the snickering began. "Say that again," one of them said, grinning. "What was that?" "Kaya," John had said. "Car. Just," with a Louisiana drawl. The laughter echoed. One boy mimicked his accent, dragging out vowels until the others howled. Another smirked. "Did y'all ride a tractor to get here?" John's face burned. He clenched his jaw and returned to his seat, every muscle tight, willing himself not to flinch. The weight of their eyes was worse than any blow. If stories of quiet strength and redemption inspire you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more. He came from Zachary, Louisiana, a small, slow town where people said sir and ma'am and looked one another in the eye, where his father, Jack Kennedy, spent his days with soil beneath his nails and pride in his spine. But none of that mattered here. Here, in this fortress of legacy and money, his roots were a liability. John had arrived at the school on scholarship. While others were dropped off in shiny European cars, his father had driven him up in their battered pickup. Jack hadn't said much. He rarely did. Just a nod, a hand on the shoulder, and a gruff, "Make the most of it." That day, John had stood at the school gates watching his father drive away, the taillights fading into the distance. He had tried to walk tall, to hold on to the calm strength his father carried. But with each day that passed, the whispers grew louder. He wasn't stupid. He saw how they looked at his shoes, scuffed and repaired too many times. How they noticed he had no name stitched into his shirts. How they asked polite questions that weren't really questions at all. "So do y'all still churn butter down there? Did you grow up in a swamp?" John smiled when he had to. He laughed when it was safest. And at night, under the thin dormitory sheets, he stared at the ceiling and recited facts in his head just to keep his mind busy. There was one place he felt grounded, when he wrote letters home. He'd described the old stone buildings, the snow he still wasn't used to, the books he read. But he never told his father about the laughter, the mockery, the deep, aching wish to belong. He imagined his father reading those letters by lamplight, nodding slowly. Jack wasn't a man of words. He was a man of presence. John remembered sitting on the porch with him one summer night years ago. The air had been thick with humidity and cicadas. A neighbor came by, angry about a boundary fence. Jack listened, said nothing for a full minute. Then, calmly, he stood. That was all. The man backed down. John had never forgotten it. But here, surrounded by sneers and sophistication, that kind of quiet power seemed to fade. He felt small. Still, each morning he rose, combed his hair, and walked into those stone halls. He didn't know it yet, but something was about to shift. Not in his classmates, not in the school, but in him, and soon, in his father too. John's pen scratched across the paper, his handwriting tight and careful. He wrote to his father weekly, though the words were increasingly curated. He described the library, the debates, the meals served on porcelain plates. He never mentioned the laughter, nor the way he'd begun to pause before speaking in class. Some truths didn't make it past the page. Back home in Zachary, his letters were sacred. Jack Kennedy read them slowly, lips barely moving, as if each sentence carried a weight he needed to absorb. He didn't speak much about them, just folded them carefully and slid them into a wooden box in the corner of the living room. Jack was not a man who had grown up with softness. His hands told the story, scarred, cracked, permanent traces of labor. As a boy, he'd risen before dawn to help his own father in the fields. School had been a luxury, but he never once complained. People in Zachary didn't complain. They endured, and they did so with pride. When John was born, Jack didn't make promises out loud, but he worked longer hours. He turned down beer at the corner bar to buy books instead. His pride was never in words. It was in action, in persistence, in giving his son a life different from his own. Everyone in town knew Jack Kennedy. He was the kind of man people nodded to on the street without needing to speak. When he walked into the feed store, conversations paused out of respect. He was solid in a way few men were anymore, not boastful, not loud, just present. John had grown up in that shadow, a place of quiet strength. He remembered being a child, watching his father fix an engine in silence, the only sound the metallic clink of tools and the hum of wind through the trees. His mother used to say, "Jack doesn't need words. He's a man of stone, but good stone, the kind that holds up a house." At the boarding school, John clung to those memories, but he also began to shift. He started rehearsing his words before speaking in class, trimming the edges of his accent. When asked about home, he'd give vague answers. "Just a small town," he'd say, avoiding the name. It wasn't shame, at least not completely. It was survival. He wanted to fit in, not to stand out. Every day felt like a test he hadn't studied for. The other boys had fathers who were senators, CEOs, men who wore tailored suits and shook hands for a living. John's father wore denim and worked with tools. How could that possibly compare? And yet, in moments of quiet, John would sit by the window of his dorm, watching snow collect on the windowsill, and remember the way his father stood during storms. How he never flinched when wind shook the roof or thunder cracked the sky. Jack Kennedy wasn't afraid of noise because he didn't need to be louder than it. Still, John began writing less often. When he did, his letters were shorter, lighter. He'd tell himself there was nothing new to say, but deep down he feared that if he wrote honestly, the words might betray the parts of himself he was trying to reshape. And so he drifted. Far from Zachary, far from the old truck, the creaky porch, the quiet nods of respect. He hadn't realized how far he'd gone. Not yet. But Jack would. The auditorium was packed. Rows of students filled the seats, jackets neatly buttoned, hair parted with precision. John stood behind the podium, notes trembling slightly in his hand. It was debate night, and he had been preparing for weeks. The topic was familiar, something about individual liberty and governmental overreach. But John wasn't worried about the content. He knew the arguments. What he feared was the delivery. He had practiced in front of a mirror, rehearsed every line until it felt like muscle memory. Still, as he cleared his throat and began, he felt the old nerves crawling up his spine. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice clear but tinged with the drawl he couldn't shake, "we must consider—" A cough came from the second row, then a whisper, a soft chuckle. He pushed on. "Our founding fathers," he said, and it happened again. A louder snicker. Another boy mimicked, just barely under his breath. "Fat hose." John paused. His hands clenched the podium. He forced his voice forward, but the words sounded alien now, rehearsed and wrong. "Believed in liberty not just as a concept, but as a lived—" "Libuti," someone echoed, exaggerating the vowels. Laughter broke out, unchecked this time. Not everyone laughed, but the ones who did didn't care who saw. John's cheeks burned. He stared at his notes, but the lines blurred. Somewhere near the back, a teacher cleared his throat. The room went still again, but the silence felt worse than the noise. He finished in a rush, barely looking up. No applause. No one met his eyes as he walked back to his seat. And in that moment, something inside him fractured. Not his pride. That had been chipped away long ago, but his will to keep pretending he could belong on their terms. That night, John didn't write a letter. He didn't eat dinner. He lay on his bed staring at the ceiling, replaying each second. Their faces, their voices. The way they laughed without restraint, as if mocking someone's voice was entertainment. As if he wasn't even real. Back in Zachary, the days passed with quiet regularity. Jack fixed tractors, paid bills in person, sat on the porch in the evenings with coffee and silence. But he noticed the change in the letters. Fewer pages, shorter answers. Less of John in the ink. One Saturday, Jack stood at the post office holding a thin envelope. He opened it and read it standing up. 3 lines. No stories, no updates. Just, "I'm fine. It's cold. Classes are fine." Jack didn't speak. He folded the letter, and slid it into his jacket pocket. That night he didn't go to bed early. He sat on the porch long after the stars came out. The next morning, before the sun rose, he packed a bag. No announcement, no plan, just a decision. He cleaned his boots, pressed his one good shirt, and pulled the old pickup out of the shed. He filled the tank, bought a road map, and started driving north. It had been years since he left Louisiana, but the road didn't feel unfamiliar, just long. By the time he crossed into New Jersey, the air had changed. Colder, sharper. People didn't wave when he passed. No one made eye contact at gas stations. Still, Jack drove on, his hands steady on the wheel. When he arrived at the school's gate, the sun was just beginning to rise. Marble buildings gleamed in pale gold. He sat for a moment, looking up at the place where his son lived now. Then he stepped out, boots crunching on frost, and walked toward the entrance. He had no words prepared. He didn't need any. The front office receptionist raised her eyebrows when Jack gave his name. She glanced at his worn jacket and boots dusted with road grit, hesitated, then picked up the phone to call the headmaster. Jack waited, hands folded, gaze calm. Minutes later, he was led down a polished hallway into an office lined with dark wood and framed diplomas. The headmaster, a tall man with silver hair and polished shoes, extended a hand. Jack took it firmly, briefly. "Mr. Kennedy," the headmaster said, cautious but cordial. "To what do we owe the visit?" Jack didn't answer right away. He looked around the office, nodded once, then said, "Just here to see my boy." The headmaster studied him. "Of course, he's in class, but we can arrange—" "No rush," Jack said. "I'll wait." He was offered a seat. He declined. Eventually, a student assistant came to lead him across the quad. Jack walked slowly, eyes taking in every brick and column. The cold didn't seem to bother him. Students glanced as he passed. Some looked curious, others confused. He was a strange sight here. Meanwhile, John sat alone in the cafeteria, pushing food around on his plate. He hadn't spoken much all morning. The sting of the debate still lingered. The laughter had faded, but the echo stayed. He didn't notice the shift in atmosphere until the room began to quiet. A few heads turned. Conversations dropped off. John looked up and froze. There, standing just inside the cafeteria doorway, was his father. Jack didn't say a word. He scanned the room, spotted his son, and walked toward him, slow, steady. The boys at nearby tables exchanged glances. One of them, Greg, the loudest from the debate, smirked and muttered something. Another chuckled, elbowed his friend. Jack reached the table. John stood, heart pounding. For a second he felt 12 years old again, caught between relief and embarrassment. "Dad," he said, unsure. Jack nodded. "Son." They stood there in silence. Around them the room waited. John could feel the eyes, the tension, the barely suppressed snickers. Then Greg spoke, just loud enough to carry. "Nice boots, sir. Bring any gaiters with you." The laughter was cautious this time. Not full, not brave. Jack turned his head and looked at the boy. No scowl, no threat. Just a long, steady look. Greg faltered. He looked away. Jack didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply stood, shoulders square, presence unmoving. In that moment, the silence grew heavier than any reprimand. Another boy cleared his throat, shifted uncomfortably. A tray clattered in the distance. John felt something in his chest loosen. For the first time in months, he didn't feel small. Jack placed a hand briefly on John's shoulder, then pulled out the chair across from him and sat. Not because he needed to eat, not because he had anything to prove, just because he belonged wherever his son did. The cafeteria never quite returned to its usual noise. Conversations resumed in hushed tones. No more jokes, no more mimicry. They didn't speak much during the meal. Jack asked how classes were going. John answered, voice steadier than before. When they finished, Jack stood and nodded once more. "I'll be around," he said. John watched him walk away, the quiet power of that presence still pulsing through the room. And for the first time, he didn't try to hide where he came from. Days after his father's visit, something in John had changed. Not dramatically, not in a way the school could announce over a speaker, but in the quiet, firm way that a boy learns the weight of who he is and chooses to carry it anyway. He began speaking more in class. Same voice, same cadence. He didn't soften the vowels anymore. When someone raised an eyebrow, he met it with a steady look, not a flinch. There was another debate. He didn't volunteer at first, but the teacher called on him. The topic was civic duty. John stood slowly, held his notes in one hand. This time there was no trembling. "My name is John Neely Kennedy," he began, voice clear. "I come from Zachary, Louisiana. We believe in work and we believe in dignity." A few boys glanced at each other, but no one laughed. He continued calmly, confidently, not rushing to change a single syllable of who he was. When he finished, the room was silent. Then slowly, one boy began to clap. Others joined. It wasn't thunderous, but it was enough. Enough to tell him that he'd crossed some invisible line. He had stopped performing. He had started standing. That evening, he sat by the dormitory window, pen in hand. He wrote a letter, not long, but honest. "Dad, I used to think I had to sound like them to matter. But I remember how you stood in that room. You didn't say a word, but they listened anyway. I get it now. It's not about talking, it's about standing." He sealed the envelope and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Years passed. John graduated with honors. He went to law school. He built a career in public service, always carrying that memory, the weight of silence, the sound of respect earned without a speech. Even in the sharp corridors of Washington, among polished rhetoric and sharpened suits, he never let go of Zachary. His voice remained steady, southern. When people commented on it, he smiled. "Comes from home," he'd say. Hard to shake something that true. Reporters asked him if he'd ever been tempted to change it. "No point," he replied. "My daddy never said much, but when he stood in a room, people paid attention. I figure if it worked for him, it'll work for me." At one public event, a young man approached him after a speech. "My folks are from Mississippi," the boy said. "I've been trying to talk like I'm from somewhere else. Your speech made me think maybe I don't have to." John clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You don't," he said. "What you are is enough." Back in Zachary, Jack still worked his land, slower now but just as steady. He didn't talk much about what his son had become, but when people asked, he'd nod once and say, "He figured it out." The truth was, John had figured out something most never do, not just who he was, but how to stay that way. And it all started with a man who walked into a room without speaking and changed everything. If this story moved you, be sure to subscribe for more powerful true life tales. And don't miss the next story waiting for you. Just click the video on screen now.